Good.
Welcome to our panel on the 2024 U.S. elections, Harris versus Trump. Very pleased that we can sponsor this event in conjunction with McLaughlin College and the York Collegium for Public Ethics. We will have two speakers today, and each will be given up to 15 minutes to address American politics and the 2024 elections. And our speakers are Professor Robert Drummond, Professor Emeritus at York University, Professor Emeritus of Politics, and former Dean of the Faculty of Arts, and Nathaniel Denaro, who is a JD student at Osgoode Hall Law School and did graduate study on the history of the American working class. So without further ado, I will hand it over to our first speaker, Professor Robert Drummond.
Thank you, Phil. I must apologize to David Leighton Brown, who I think is joining us on Zoom, or we'll see the recording later, since he's already heard virtually everything I want to say about this, because I made a presentation at a gathering he organized in Richmond Hill United Church some weeks ago. Basically, what I wanted to talk about was the undecided vote, such as it is. I think one of the things we know about this election is that every poll says it's very close. And we also know that something like 80% or more of the electorate have probably made their decision already about how they're going to vote, if not almost everyone. The difficulty is that there remains this very small margin of undecided voters to whom the campaigns are currently appealing. And my guess is that there will be two major elements of that appeal. One will be to try to persuade people who haven't decided yet that they should go out and vote when they do decide. Getting the turnout of the people who have decided is vitally important, but also persuading those who haven't yet decided is probably also important. But it's important, I think, to figure out what it is that will appeal to the people who are currently undecided. And I think the question I would raise is what will the Harris campaign have to do to appeal? Because I think looking at the two candidates at this point and their campaigns, I find it very difficult, being a person of, first of all, being in Canada and being reasonably well educated. It's difficult for me to imagine why anyone is prepared to vote for Donald Trump, but half the American electorate is quite happy to do so. And I guess my question would be, how does the Harris campaign persuade the 10 or 15% of the electorate who haven't yet decided how they're going to vote, that her campaign is the one that should get their support? I think there are two areas of concern that she's going to have difficulty dealing with. One of them is employment. They're both related to the economy. I think immigration is an issue in which there is considerable interest and already considerable division, but my guess is that appealing to the undecided on that basis is not going to be a very strong appeal or necessary appeal. But on the economy, it's necessary to persuade the undecided that there is some reason that they need to support Harris. One of those issues is employment. At the moment, the economy is in pretty good shape in the United States, but employment figures are up. The unemployment rate is lower than it's ever been. It was lowest in generation a couple of weeks ago. It's a little higher now, but still within the range of what we normally think of as full employment. So why is it that so many mostly young men, are still feeling that the economy is not in their favor? And employment may be one of those reasons. That is, while there are lots of jobs available, the question is whether or not the people who are getting ready to vote in this election and who are undecided are people who are finding work in their area and for which they are qualified. There may be lots of jobs, but if there are jobs that are remote from where they're living and require skills they don't possess, then it's not going to be particularly attractive to them, or not going to convince them the economy is doing better. Considerable number of people I've seen interviewed, anecdotal information, but considerable number of people being interviewed have said they felt the economy was better when Trump was in office. And I think for the most part, what they mean about that is not employment, but inflation. There was a very significant spike in inflation, partly as a result of the pandemic, but it has now come down. That is to say, the inflation has come down in the sense that prices are not increasing as quickly as they once did, but prices are not declining. And that means that for the most part, people know that prices were lower 4 or 5, 6 years ago than they are now, and they want someone to blame. And of course, it's easy to blame the current government. Now, there are two possible causes for inflation, we know. One, we call a kind of cost push inflation. Costs rise for producers of goods and services, and they pass on those increases to customers, and as a consequence, inflation increases, prices go up. The costs rose in part during the pandemic because of breaches to supply chains, reliance on supply for very goods from a variety of sources to make products that were purchased in the United States, were in some cases disrupted by the pandemic, where it's not possible to get the goods that you needed to make the goods you wanted to sell as quickly as you could in the past. You could pay a premium to get them, and therefore your costs went up and prices rose accordingly. As the pandemic began to fade, not that it's gone away, but it's certainly not the threat it once was, the supply chains began to reconnect and prices began to stabilize. Not yet to come down for the most part, but at least to stabilize. You can't really blame the current government for what happened during a pandemic to supply chains. However, one of the things that governments did, both the Trump administration and the Biden administration, was to spend considerably more money, put cash into people's hands, either in the case of the Trump administration by directly sending checks to people, and in the case of the Biden administration by investing in a lot of infrastructure spending, and in some cases direct grants, that allowed people to spend more than they would otherwise have been able to do. Now, during the pandemic, it would be very difficult to say, as people were facing depression-like conditions, well, we don't care. We're not going to provide you with any means to improve your lot. And both the Trump administration and the Biden administration spent money to bring people back from the brink of disaster during the pandemic. And that expenditure contributed to rising costs, as people had, this is what we call demand pull inflation. As people had the money to chase scarce goods, they did so, and the prices of those goods went up. The only way to deal with demand pull inflation is to raise interest rates. That's at least the way in which traditional economics views the problem. If you raise interest rates, the central bank, independent of government, raises interest rates in order to depress demand, in both demand by consumers and demand by investors, so that prices will begin to stabilize, if not actually come down. There's a danger, of course, that you put the interest rates down so low that, you raise the interest rates so high that you put a stress on the economy, and not only does demand go down, but prices begin to fall because people are actually being thrown out of work. That hasn't happened in the United States. On the whole, they have had a recession-free decline in inflation. And as a consequence, people ought to be feeling pretty good about that. But on the whole, if your costs went up and have not come down, and you're looking for someone to blame, the central bank, you don't get to vote for the central bank, and you don't get to vote for supply chains. You can, however, vote for the government. And if you don't like what's happening in your life, and you want someone to blame, frequently they blame the government. And the current government is connected to Harris because she was the vice president in that administration. So I think she's facing a challenge particularly among young men, some of them unemployed, some of them employed in jobs that are paying less than they think they should get, or that they were once getting. Prices have not come down. As a consequence, I think she's got a difficult task to persuade people that she has a plan to make the economy better, and that plan will work, and that they should not put their faith in Donald Trump, even though they feel that the economy was in better shape when he was the president. Now, what does that translate to in terms of the vote? I don't know. My guess is that nobody knows for sure what the vote will be like at this point. Everybody says it's going to be very close, going to be close even in the major battleground states, where the something like 20,000 voters across the United States might decide the result of the election across 7 states. if a large proportion of the people in those states are as yet undecided and are putting their hope in the economy and improvement in the economy, can Harris persuade them that she has the means to do that? Or can Trump persuade them that putting tariffs on overseas goods and deporting large numbers of aliens, whether documented or not, is going to improve the economic lot of people in rural America, which is where I think much of the support is. That will probably determine the outcome. At the moment, I'm too cowardly to make a guess.
Thank you, Professor Drummond. And our next speaker is Nathaniel Denaro.
Hello, everyone who's joining us in person and listening online. Now, if you're like me and have been keeping up with the US election, a lot has transpired over the last few months. I think it would be safe to say that whatever happens on November 5th, we have all watched some truly history-making events, from the disastrous Trump-Biden debate to the various assassination attempts on Trump's life. That said, I would like to focus on the pivot to Kamala Harris and the particular narratives that have shaped her campaign as we try to keep up with the many faces of candidate Harris and the Democratic Party. As some of you may recall, her nomination was significant as it revitalized the floundering Democratic campaign. She brought a certain youth and enthusiasm that was refreshing after years of Trump and Biden. Moreover, her selection of Tim Walz seemed to energize the progressive factions within the party. In the early stages, this translated into an incorporation of some economically populist elements, like the desire to ban price gouging. But that was then, and this is now. And in that time, this talking point has dropped from a lot of her public appearances. I am by no means naive as to how the Democratic Party operates. It's very much a neoliberal machine. But I think this assessment can also be applied to Kamala Harris, a politician who doesn't really have an identity and has struggled to define herself during the latter half of this electoral cycle. But this lack of identity is by no means new. If we look back to the 2020 Democratic primary, she was one of the first people to drop out, running a weak campaign riddled with patchwork progressive ideas while not totally committing to an openly progressive platform. She seems to have renounced a lot of this rhetoric in the time since. As in interview after interview, Harris has gone from claiming to be just like Joe Biden to pledging to be the opposite, while not differentiating herself with different policy solutions. Meanwhile, she's conceded significant ground to the Republican Party, capitulating to hysteria surrounding the border and immigration. And while the Harris campaign keeps repeating that Trump killed the so-called bipartisan border bill that would have addressed this area, voters don't seem to believe it, with 54% still thinking Trump is best suited to address this area. I think this is ultimately reflective of a gap in messaging. Harris struggles to articulate what she will do differently if elected. She talks about an opportunity economy and then emphasizes giving loans to small business owners. While I can appreciate that the economy is often the top of mind for many, I would think that even small business owners are struggling from a lack of affordable rental units, lack of housing, and other social services. The point is that there is a dearth in tangible policy solutions that are not just tax cuts and tax credits. Contrast this with the Trump campaign, which is running on a clear, albeit racist message that no matter the issue, there's an illegal immigrant to blame, whether that be the economy, crime, or the cost of living. Trump has proposed a wave of mass deportations as a solution. It's a simplistic message, and this isn't some type of praise or support of it. US citizens are, after all, more likely to be arrested for violent offenses, including drug possession, compared to their undocumented counterparts. And when it comes to a drug like fentanyl, which has dominated the debate stage, more than 90% of it has been stopped at official points of entry in the possession of US citizens. But this boiling down of socioeconomic issues seems to thrive against a Harris campaign that has struggled to offer an alternative vision. So what's going on here? Allow my ranting to be grounded in some more substantial analysis of the Democratic Party. I focus on the Democrats primarily because this seems to be their election to lose, squandering an early lead in the polls and Harris's initial enthusiasm. So to this I ask, win or lose the election, are Harris's difficulties indicative of greater problems within the Democratic Party? Mainly, does she still stand for something other than the same neoliberal programs but in different packaging? As a starting point, I think the best way to tackle this rising right-wing sentiment is by addressing the root cause of it, which can be found in often socioeconomic discontentment. And yes, of course, racism and xenophobia play crucial roles in Trumpism. The sentiments themselves become more palatable when the working class feels vulnerable and ignored by the political elite. This was the novelty of Trump in 2016. He broke with the establishment and spoke directly to working class Americans. Is he a working class hero as J.D. Vance has tried to portray him? Absolutely not. There's nothing emancipatory in tax cuts for billionaires or celebrating the firing of striking workers. This will not advance the material conditions of the demographic, just as the party's obsession with banning trans people or abortion will not lead to a reopening of factories in the Rust Belt. Culture war issues notwithstanding, there are important socioeconomic changes that must be taken into account. Mainly that 50 years of neoliberal hegemony have decimated the prospects of many Americans. Contrasting the post-war period to today, we see a steep decline in the number of well-paying, unionized manufacturing jobs, which were the lifeblood of middle American must-win states like Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. The positions that they were replaced with are largely low-paying and precarious. Take in that from 1979 to 2013, wages for the bottom 90% of workers have only increased by about 15% on average, while productivity has gone up by 74%. This means that workers are getting more done, generating more revenue for their employers while not being properly compensated. These conditions are compounded by the erosion of already limited social safety nets. The effect, rising income inequality, undermines one's opportunity for social mobility. The American dream, which is so essential to the national mythos, has gone from an aspirational idea to little more than a pipe dream. This dynamic has been crucial to Trump's messaging dating back to his first presidential run. Capitalizing on a certain nostalgia for the post-war period, Trump has mixed certain conservative fixations with cultural issues. If we remember Trump's 2016 pledge to end the war on Christmas, with an interesting economic analysis. This centered on the promised return of the manufacturing sector, and with it, the ability to buy a home and provide for a family with a simple 9 to 5. But what actually happened? Trump did not usher in the revitalization of the sector. While his numbers were slightly higher than the Obama administration's, they were surpassed by Biden. Trump's pre-COVID numbers were about 12.7 million jobs compared to Biden's 12.9 million in September. So with all of Trump's bluster about trade wars, his strategy was not that successful in practice, with marginal gains at best. And sorry to be the bearer of bad news here, but there likely never will be a return of manufacturing to the country, at least to the highs we saw during the 1970s. This is because post-war Fordism was a dramatically different means of socioeconomic organization. This fetishized male breadwinner household was largely subsidized by an active welfare state funded by high taxes on the wealthy and benefited from limited globalization and trade liberalization. A reversal of any of these provisions would be antithetical to the neoliberal consensus espoused by both parties. To distract from this impossibility, Republicans have made it a point to substitute real questions of class and power with those of culture. This is precisely why media cycles are inundated with stories vilifying migrants, rather than billionaires fresh off Trump tax cuts lobbying the government to cut Social Security, break up unions, and ship jobs overseas. This is to say, class still matters, and Americans, as confused as they can be at times, still identify as such, with about a third of Americans viewing themselves as being part of the working class. This notion undoubtedly has an impact on the narratives they use to cope and shape their own identities. Now, with our descent into Trumpland out of the way, allow me to turn back to the Harris campaign in the Democratic primary. I'll begin by emphasizing that the modern Democratic Party is far removed from its working class New Deal heritage. This model has been replaced by the third way neoliberal variant, championed by Bill Clinton in the 1990s. Kamala Harris, or Comrade Kamala, as the Republicans have tried to label her, is by no means a progressive. She's a moderate centrist at best, constrained and supported by a business-friendly party elite. Similarly, we must not allow Tim Walz's selection to fool us. Those of us who have watched the vice presidential debate would have seen that some of Walz's key selling points, his friendly, folksy demeanor, progressive impulses, and sympathy for those suffering in Gaza have been suppressed. He seems to be on a tight leash and is being forced to return to what the party seems to think is a winning message. Emphasize Trump's instability, concede on immigration hysteria, and make vague promises about the opportunity economy. But this plan is fundamentally flawed because Americans do have an appetite for change, especially when it comes to progressive causes. The majority of Americans, about 57%, think that the government should provide its citizens with healthcare. 55% favor the increasing of taxes on the wealthy. And remember climate change? Nearly 70% of Americans support initiatives like green energy and a plan to become carbon neutral by 2050. So what does this data tell me? That there's an opportunity for the Harris campaign to pivot in a more progressive direction on key social issues. And when she has done so, like the promise to ban price gouging, has been rewarded. A Bloomberg poll of voters in the swing states of Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin have favored the notion by significant margins. 80% overall, including 78% of independents and 70% of Republicans. So one would think that, based on everything I've said about the Harris campaign, they would be doing more of this. I'm sure her and her advisors have access to the same polling data. But surprise, surprise, they have not. Instead, centering their campaign on the idea of on this almost mythical idea of the moderate Republican, the never Trump crowd. A lot of her messaging has changed in accordance with this, as she's been doing campaign tours with Liz Cheney and promising to have a Republican in cabinet if elected. And after saying this out loud, I think I need a moment to kind of recover and unpack everything. First of all, does anyone actually like Liz Cheney or Dick Cheney too, who has also endorsed Harris? Who is this for exactly? According to an Axios poll from last year, 61% of Americans have a negative view of the invasion of Iraq. Donald Trump even condemned it during a debate with Hillary Clinton back in 2016. So it's curious to campaign with someone whose family is so deeply associated with an unpopular war effort. Now, what's all this about having a Republican in cabinet? I have a lot of issues with this, mostly because Harris seems to have forgotten which party she's running for. But to this I ask, I think the very logical question of, where would she put this person in cabinet? How would she reconcile their ideological differences with her own campaign promises? Or is she maybe even saying this quiet part out loud, that a Republican very easily be slotted into a Democratic administration because they're almost more or less two sides of the same coin? And as a final point, if I'm a hypothetical Republican, why would I vote Harris for one cabinet member when I could have them all if I vote Trump? I think that this plan is causing the Democrats to ignore some potential down ballot consequences. While so-called moderate Republican may prefer Harris to Trump at the top of the ticket, there's a chance that Congress could be split further down. So rather than running on bold policy objectives, most of our rhetoric has focused on Donald Trump and his own instability as a candidate, often invoking the specter of January 6th. But as a result, she spent considerably less time critiquing the Republican platform writ large, which is just as problematic and could be decisive in a split Congress. This leads me to a bigger picture analysis of the Democratic Party. In playing it safe and pivoting to center right on issues, there is a clear effort to create a new coalition of voters. The New Deal Democratic Party, preferred by the American working class, is long dead, and many of those voters have been absorbed by the Republican Party. The elite, however, don't seem to mind. As Democratic Senate leader Chuck Schumer said in 2017, quote, "For every blue-collar Democrat we lose in Western Pennsylvania, we pick up 2 moderate Republicans in the suburbs of Philadelphia," end quote. So rather than stop this hemorrhaging, the party's official line has been working class, who needs them? My concern here is that this forces the Democrats to play catch up with Republicans for the same base of support. But the thing about suburban Republicans is that they are suburban Republicans. By nature, they operate from a more conservative reactionary viewpoint. And this requires, as we are seeing, the adoption and legitimation of more fringe hysterical sentiments over things like immigration. The effects are twofold. On the one level, it ignores actual questions of socioeconomic power, while on the other, it makes Republicans look like they're right on the issues. It allows Trump to turn around and say, "See, what did we tell you? Immigration is real. The Democrats acknowledge it, but we're the only serious party." Republicans own this issue, but this hasn't stopped Harris from pivoting. In a CNN town hall, she remarked that on the border wall, that she's not, quote, "not afraid of good ideas where they occur," end quote. In conceding, Harris looks weak and wishy-washy on border safety. And for Americans concerned about it, why vote for her when you can vote for Trump, who's been consistent on this issue? This is to say that the American political system is shifting further to the right, as Democrats are opting to chase conservative media narratives rather than address real socioeconomic inequality. And if polling is to be believed, this strategy isn't working, demonstrated by the 50-50 split. After decades of neoliberalism, the Democrats are a party without a real identity. Being Republican light is not sustainable and will not allow for long-term success. I think that even if Harris does pull off the presidency, it will be with a split Congress or close, and a likely political gridlock. This gridlock will inevitably lead to the need for further compromise and a continued shift to the right. In closing, I think this election has largely been the Democrats to lose, with Harris's early lead in the polls being squandered. I don't think Kamala Harris is a perfect candidate, and she struggled with a lack of charisma and inability to articulate policy objectives. But this uncharismatic candidate dilemma can easily be fixed with policy solutions, which the Democrats are unwilling to do. So as to what will happen November 5th, we'll see. I'll reserve my prediction until later in our discussion. But thank you. In the meantime, thank you for your attention, and I look forward to any questions. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you to our speakers, Nathaniel, Denaro, and to Robert Drummond. Do we have any questions from the floor? Questions from our in-person audience or our online audience? If we don't, I'll give you a moment to think. Perhaps I can pose my question to both of our speakers. And that is this, that because this election seems to be coming down to the wire, the likelihood of contesting the election results is extreme, particularly from the Republicans. But I don't think that the Democrats are above appealing the results themselves. So if this does happen, how is it going to work out, and how will it turn out, and how long will it take to get firm election results?
Let me start off not actually answering your question, Phil, because I think the answer probably depends on who wins. If Trump wins, it will not take very long for the whole thing to be resolved. If Harris wins, it may take months, and we may go through the same sort of thing we did the last time. What I wanted to do, though, I guess, was to start off by saying I agree with most of Nathaniel's analysis. I think he's got it dead right about the Democratic Party and its shift. However, I don't think that shift begins with Harris. I don't think he actually said it did, but the idea that Harris began the campaign with a lead in the polls, it was still within the margin of error. I don't think she's ever had a lead that was not within the margin of error. I don't think she squandered a lead. She never had one. I think the issue that you point out about the rightward shift of the American electorate is probably there. I just don't know that it began as late in the day as you're implying. I think it did begin probably with Bill Clinton, if not earlier. I think Obama was, I used to say when Obama was in office that he was the last living moderate Republican, because he wasn't really doing the New Deal kind of Democratic Party that had been in there before. The question, I guess, though, is if you're Harris and you're running an electorate that you believe is has shifted to the right, are you going to regain it by pursuing a series of progressive positions? It's maybe a little unfair to say that she tried that when she was running for the Democratic nomination in 2020, and it didn't work out very well for her. It's not clear that it would work out any better for her now. I would like to see the Democratic Party in the United States be more of a progressive entity than it is, but I'm not voting in this election. And my wife is voting in Indiana, where it almost doesn't matter what she thinks. So I think it's hard to figure out what to recommend to the Democratic Party at this time. If you say, yes, they should become more progressive, my guess is that that's, first of all, they don't have time to pivot in the 4 or 5 days remaining before the, well, actually 6 days remaining, I guess, before the election. But I'm not sure that a pivot to the left is going to work for them in the short run. Now, in the long run, maybe it will. In the meantime, I guess the question is, how do you disconnect the working class voters who have lined up with Trump from their presumption that he is going to serve their interests? You pointed out several ways that he's not going to serve their interests. I'm not sure that Harris has made that as clear as she should. I would say that, by the way, you're absolutely right. She does not appeal to voters as working class. She appeals to the middle class. I was from the middle class, she said, and I want to, and it reminds me of Trudeau's, I'm working for the middle class and those who are working hard to join it. Well, that's maybe what you need to say to voters, I guess, although I'm reminded that in the early 1970s, no, in the late 1960s, there was a poll done in Ontario in which voters were asked to sort a series of self-defining labels and put them in different piles as to whether they defined them as, or they described them very well, fairly well, or not at all. And something like a quarter of the respondents, closer to 30% of the respondents, said that both middle class and working class described them very well. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means you have a very flexible class analysis, I guess. But it also means that voters don't think in those terms in the way that perhaps politics specialists and sociologists do. Anyway, that's a long rant on Nathaniel's very good analysis, and not an answer to Phil's question, except that I think if Trump wins, it will not take long to know what the result was, and if Harris wins, it'll take months.
Yeah, I guess I'll give my my 2 cents on that too. I agree. I think if Trump wins, this will be a very quick process. But if the Democrats win, it'll be another story. Trump has already espoused a lot of his own view on it, that we'll count the polls, we'll count the ballots, but it has to be done a certain way. So he's already kind of priming the pump that he'll be very skeptical and drag his feet on accepting the results of the election. But in terms of identity and I guess the Democratic Party, this broader picture sense, yeah, I think 5 days is way too late to go start deciding to become progressive. And I don't think Kamala Harris is the proper candidate to do that. I think she's kind of tanked her own reputation. Was first a kind of moderate, then she became a progressive in 2020, and now she's pivoting back to the center. So I don't think she has a lot of credibility with a lot of voters, whether those are progressives or whether those are these moderate Republicans that she's trying to appeal to. So there's a lot of outstanding issues and issues with her as a candidate. In terms of what happens from here, my only concern, and I cut this out because I was worried about time, but what happens if the Democrats lose? And I don't think that there's going to be this soul searching on the part of the party of like, maybe we didn't run a good campaign. I think we might see with Hillary Clinton in 2016. And what did they do? They found a scapegoat. They blamed the Bernie Sanders progressive crowd for not showing up to vote out in force enough. And it's kind of their fault and these things. It's the Democratic Party always finds a way to weasel out of accepting any fault for anything they do. And I think we might see the same thing now, like in terms of polling with young men in particular, Obama lecturing African-American men specifically a few weeks ago over not supporting Harris enough, even though I think there's a 70% approval rate from the demographic. So I think there's underlying socioeconomic concerns and policies that can be used to address a lot of this flight and hemorrhaging from certain demographics, but the Democrats are very hesitant to do that because they always want to appeal to this very conservative, moderate idea of the American voter.
Well, thank you, Nathaniel and Robert. A further question, if we don't have questions from our audience, but first of all, do you have questions? Any questions from our audience? Well, I would say that we are in the final stages of the pre-election process. Indeed, millions of Americans have already cast their votes. And some are arguing that that's a sign of how the elections are going to turn out. As a matter of fact, a number of pundits have indicated that you can predict the outcome of the election quite accurately on the number of people who have voted early. So that brings up one issue I'd like you to address. But the other one was this, that the last couple of days in this campaign are extremely significant. It's not really too late to pivot because Trump seems to have the wind in his sails. But is there any way that the Democrats could pivot even in the last few days, which would help their chances of success at the polls?
I think Harris has already described her talk at the Ellipse as the closing of her campaign. I don't think there's any intention to make another message. And Trump had his big rally at Madison Square Gardens, doesn't seem to have heard him, might have heard him in some quarters. Maybe the Puerto Rican vote will be enough to turn the tide in one or two of the battleground states. Pennsylvania, I guess, has the largest Puerto Rican population. And some of them may not have already voted, and some of them may not have already voted for Trump. Although last night on NewsHour, somebody was being interviewed who said, in effect, yes, it was a terrible thing, but that comic said, I think it's a bad thing about the Trump campaign, but I've already voted for Trump. So, it's troubling, but I think that it is too late to pivot. And candidly, I think there is not, as Nathaniel says, there's not an appetite in the Democratic Party at the moment for the progressive wing to dominate. If there were that appetite, Bernie Sanders would have done much better in their search for the nomination. Between Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, it's a significant number of Democrats who would have preferred the party to be in a more progressive direction. But Biden was a centrist, and Harris is even more of a centrist, I think. Biden had more of a working class appeal, perhaps, than Harris. I don't see this change coming until the election is over. And then it's conceivable, if the Democrats lose, that they do have although I think you're right, it'd be difficult to imagine them actually having a kind of rethink of their position. But you live in hope that they may say, in effect, that didn't work. Appealing to moderate Republicans and women who want reproductive rights and young men who think that the small business loans will help them. That didn't work. So what do we need to do differently? I'm not sure that's likely to happen, but as I say, you live in hope.
Yeah, I mean, in these dying days of the election, how many voters are left? Because Bob, to your point, you were emphasizing that, you know, this undecided voter proportion, very small group, not a lot left. And I think interestingly enough, first of all, it's this pivot from 2020 where early voting and mailing voting has been this villain for the Republicans, and them, a lot of them embracing it, encourage people get out and vote. And I think the Trump campaign in particular, while we can criticize Donald Trump, I think he's been kind of crazy in in his desire to appeal to as many voters as possible. And with this, I mean, like, he's with the RFK endorsement, he's appealing to these fringe conspiracy theorists who might not tend to vote historically, come out and vote, come out and vote. A few weeks ago, he promised an indigenous tribe in the US federal recognition if they vote for him. So he's appealing to maybe demographics that might not get out to vote as much. And his approach, I guess someone in his campaign has this idea of there's not a lot of voters up for grabs. So what can you do? Try to mobilize maybe people who don't vote. You might agree with you on issues, but maybe get them out to vote because they don't want to vote. Versus the Harris campaign, which I think is maybe doing, I guess, more of a traditional thing of, or not even a traditional thing, because I don't even know who the modern base of the Democratic Party is. I think it's kind of siphoning away this never Trump crowd of Republicans rather than actually having bold ideas and trying to encourage people to get out to vote, like we might have saw maybe with Obama, of this hopeful message, regardless of his policies, to come out and vote. This is going to be change. We really mean it this time, please. And there's been like these dueling styles, I think, that are happening in the background.
David has a question.
Go ahead, David.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you to the panel. If there isn't much of an opportunity for a pivot in this last 5 days, though there is still an opportunity for someone, more likely Trump, to put their foot in their mouth, I'd like to focus on the swing states. If the polls are correct, that the outcome is going to be decided by the 7 swing states, and as Bob Drummond said earlier, by a very small number of votes in those swing states. I'd like to ask each of you what you think will be the deciding issue or issues in each of those. So far, you have treated the electorate rather monolithically. And if you look at those 7 states, are there different issues that are salient in some or individual ones of them? And how do you think each of the campaigns has addressed those particular swing issues?
Thank you, David. We'll hand the microphone over to Professor Bob.
Let me start with Arizona. I think Arizona, the border is probably the principal issue. Immigration is an issue, but it's also a question of rising costs there. And so it'd be a challenge for Harris to say this is, that I'm sufficiently well organized on the border that you should vote for me. I'm you know, that I might build some wall. When we had a plan that would have been bipartisan, might have worked better and was turned down. So that's Arizona. Nevada, I think the Democrats are going to lose Nevada, probably on the basis that costs have risen there and people are blaming the government for it. As far as Georgia, and you didn't mention Georgia, I don't think, or did you? Georgia, I think is very interesting. It will depend to a large extent on whether there's much demographic change in Georgia, whether Savannah and Atlanta are gathering more voters who are likely to vote Democratic than they had in the past. The rest of the state will remain, I think, pretty Republican. North Carolina is interesting to me because my nephew and his wife and family live there. They're active Democrats. It hasn't gone well for them recently, although they do have Democratic governors and well gerrymandered Republican legislature. I think North Carolina is close, but I'm not sure why. I'm not sure what the issues there are other than costs and possibly a sense of Trump being a threat to democracy may play in some quarters. In the blue wall states, you know, the Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania is the plum everyone needs. Trump can't really win without it, and Harris probably can't win without it. And I'm not sure what's going to play there. I think the fact that immigration is not as big an issue there, I don't think. It probably is a matter of costs and rising costs and employment and industries that are dying. Although, frankly, the Rust Belt has been there for a long time. Ohio, Pennsylvania, Michigan have lost those industries many years ago. Some of the industries are coming back, but as Nathaniel says, probably not the kind of manufacturing jobs that fueled the working class resurgence after the Second World War. Wisconsin, I don't know. I'm reminded that Hillary Clinton lost Wisconsin by about 20,000 votes, and 70,000 fewer people voted in Milwaukee than had voted in the previous election. And if those were people who were disenchanted with the Democrats and they're still disenchanted, that's going to be a problem. But if they're coming back out to vote for a Democrat again, then Harris will probably win that. And what's the issue there? Again, I really don't know. It's a whole range of these issues. I think any one of them may play fairly effectively. And as far as Michigan is concerned, there is some concern with the fact that it has the largest Arab American population in the country, and they are not happy with the Democrats' support for Israel, and they're largely ignoring what's going on in Gaza. But do they think Trump is going to be better for them in that regard? I have my doubts. So if that may be an issue there, but I don't think it will be the main one. So in short, I don't have very good answers on what I think the main issues will be.
I think I'm gonna say a very short answer, and I'm gonna say all eyes on Michigan. I'm looking at Michigan. I think both candidates have to win Michigan. I think, as Bob had mentioned, the high Arab American population in the state of Michigan, there's about 200,000 of them, historically very reliable bloc for the Democrats. And if they just choose not to turn out, forget even voting against Trump, if they don't turn out, Harris will lose the state. And if she loses the state, it's going to be a very narrow path to victory from there. So I would watch Michigan. I think I'm going to make a prediction. I'll say I think she's going to lose Michigan because of the Democratic Party stance on the war in Gaza, and the Democrats' just refusal to maybe moderate a bit or just accept the concerns that a lot of these people are saying, because they have family in the region that are being killed in bombing campaigns, and the Democrats have just kind of ignored that and stuck to the bipartisan consensus that Israel can do no wrong. But let's not get too much into foreign policy here, despite how important an issue it is in that state. So I think the one issue in Michigan will be decisive.
Well, speaking of Michigan, some of the Arab leaders in Michigan have given public support to Trump. And as far as I know, none of them has given any support to the Democrats. So on that basis, there might be some indication that Trump or the Republicans rather than Democrats will receive more support from the Arabic community in Michigan. Do we have any more questions from our audience? All right, I have another question. It's profoundly disturbing to everyone, I think, the rhetoric that the campaign has taken, and it's getting worse. It's gotten to the point where you don't even want to repeat the accusations and the epithets that are thrown by one party at members of another or supporters of another. And this vitriol is difficult to put under the rug at the conclusion of the election. So how is it going to affect the ongoing social fabric of the U.S.?
I think it's terrible. I suspect the social fabric of the U.S. is irrevocably, I won't say broken, but certainly damaged by this. I think it's not quite like the Civil War where brother fights brother, but it is a situation in which people aren't speaking to their friends because they know that they're going to be in a fight about politics. There's a significant proportion of the population, of course, who ignore politics between elections. They say the election campaign doesn't really begin until Labor Day in the United States, even though it's run on for most of a year before that. But in some cases, it doesn't really begin for most people until 4 or 5 days before the election, and they're avoiding public news. And my guess is that more people are avoiding political news now than a decade ago because it seems so vitriolic, so nasty, is used in basic word. And I think it's gonna be hard to get past that. Now, I also think it would be interesting to see what happens if Trump loses the election and the Congress is divided. What will happen to Republicans in the Congress? My suspicion is that if Trump is sort of out of the play because he's basically lost and lost and lost, will Republicans in the Congress feel a willingness to be rather more moderate than they have in the past? Hard to say, but I think of Mitch McConnell, who probably won't be there for long after this, but who is clearly antipathetic to Trump during the hearings after January 6th, but voted not to impeach, not to convict him anyway. Because I think the real reason he feared a retribution from the Republican Party. Will the Republican Party change if Trump wins? And will the vitriol decline to some extent? If he wins, I think he'll look wrapping up.
I mean, anecdotal, I have like a lot of friends who are, Canadian, not voting the election, but a lot of them tune out too, just based on how toxic the rhetoric has been. I think there's just been, as a result, for beginning with Trump, a normalization of it. I don't think voters are being put off as much as you would think. The polls are basically 50-50 if we believe them, with a very low portion of undecided voters. And if you're not decided now based on a lot of just the harmful rhetoric coming out of the Trump campaign, I don't know what else would be that nudge you need over to say, maybe, maybe Trump isn't for me, right? So I think it's just been normalized, and I don't know if you could go back from how the parties just talk about one another from here. Like, I think once it's kind of status quo established, that's it. But I don't know, maybe there's a beacon of hope if you watch the vice presidential debate and you saw the way Tim Walz and JD Vance treated each other. So I don't know, maybe post-Trump, maybe we do get a return to normal, but we'll see. I it's hopefully a bit cynical, but also a bit optimistic, contradictory, but
Cautiously.
Yes, there is a ray of hope there because the heir apparent in the Republican Party seems to be JD Vance. And the Democrats are a bit more difficult because if Harris loses, then what would Biden's response, for example, to that be? And the response of many Democrats, perhaps they'll say that we could have won with Biden, but we lost with Harris. I can see that as a scenario. And if Trump loses, well, I see JD Vance coming in to fill in his place. And Vance is probably much more moderate than Trump, and certainly a very decent fellow and a person who can get along with a wide range of people. So there's hope there for the Republicans, I think, if Trump loses. But if he wins, then we're back to square one and even worse.
You've heard decency used as a synonym for malleable before. I mean, JD Vance is not evidently a decent person. He's someone who's chameleon-like. He goes with the flow. He treated Waltz reasonably well on the stage. He's a lawyer. He knows how to treat your opponent like a human being. It doesn't change his policy positions, and it doesn't mean that he's decent in the sense that he is not willing to go with the tide if it seems to be, even if it's a toxic tide, as he has done with Trump. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there's decency there.
If I can also comment on that, I think JD Vance is very interesting because in a way it's almost this more old school Republican disdain for the working class that he's kind of fashioned in his early days. Like his whole hillbilly elegy is him like distancing himself from his, I don't want to say backwater roots, but this, being from Appalachia, coming from a family that had a lot of issues, and then he becomes a successful guy and he's turning it around of, I'm successful, blah, 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 things like that. And now he's tried to very rebrand it, being, no, I'm very pro working class, things like that. So yeah, JD Vance is very interesting. I remember early when I guess when after he got picked, the media attention, a lot of the rhetoric and things that he said about, childless cat ladies and how parents should get bonus votes depending on how many children they have. So I think there's a lot of problematic ideas he has in and of himself as a candidate, but he just presents himself, I guess, in a more eloquent way versus Trump. Yeah. And I don't know, maybe that's the appeal of Trumpism, that Trump says things very bluntly. So we'll see what happens with that. But JD Vance, you know, it's just one to watch and be cautious of, I guess.
Again, do we have any questions from our audience?
I'd be curious if Steve has any comments.
Yes, Steve. Are you there?
Newman's name appears, but his face does not.
All right, do you have any questions?
Um,
Is that Steve?
no, it's me actually.
Oh,
Can
Greg, go ahead.
May I say something?
Yes.
I guess I'm a bit troubled because it seems as though we're treating the two parties as if they're similar. So you talk a lot about policies and so on. And I'm not sure that the Republican Party is the same. Not, and I don't mean in some policy sense. I think in a larger, if I can put it this way, political sense, it has transformed. And I've been surprised about the campaign because there hasn't. I would have said the Democrats should have focused on the anti-democracy aspects of Trump a lot more, because that's, in a sense, that is the issue. What makes anybody think Trump's going to go away if he loses? Really? I mean, January 6th was just a taste. If Trump had maybe he is as clearly as incompetent as he was then. But I'm reminded of something that Lenin said many, many years ago, that you can control a country if you've got 25% of the population on your side. Trump has at least 30%. There's at least 30% of the electorate that doesn't give a hoot about democracy as, at least as it's defined, and really wouldn't care if there was a fascist in power. And the Madison Square Garden rally, which was an echo of an earlier fascist rally, is a signal. And I mean, Trump is saying what he will do, and it's not democratic. And I'm just a bit surprised about the tenor of the discussion, because these are not equatable parties. They are not. And there's a real danger, and there's a danger for the world, and for us particularly, because we're right next to this. Anyway, it's just a comment. It's not a question. I'm deeply troubled by the American election, and I'm troubled by a notion that we should treat, oh, this is just another election about policies, and because it's not. Anyway, that's my 2 cents worth.
I think it's true that there is a kind of cult-like characteristic of the Republican Party at present. At least the 30% or so, I think you're right, who would do whatever Trump wants done. What would happen if he loses, and what happens with the people who are moderate Republicans, or at least non-Trump Republicans? Is that group of people likely to try to be somewhat more successful in bringing back the Republican Party of old? Not clear to me, but it's conceivable that the people who are behind Trump, no matter what he does, shoot someone on Fifth Avenue in daylight and lose no votes, are they going to be willing to maintain that degree of unthinking support if once again he loses? Are they going to continue to believe that he didn't actually lose? And that's the concern, I guess. But if they're persuaded that there's nothing to be gained in pursuing the election further, will the old Republicans come back into being again? And will you see the kind of Mitt Romney style Republicans try to make a comeback, and will they succeed? I'm concerned, as I think you are, that it may not happen, that in fact, it's more likely that people will simply turn off politics and put their life into their religion or their family or their business in a way that doesn't make it necessary for them to think about what government's doing. Especially as Republicans, they probably prefer government to do as little as possible. That is traditional Republicans. It's worrisome, but I guess I'm uncertain that the old Republican Party might not reemerge at some point if Trump goes away. If he goes away. I guess we all go away at some point.
Yeah. I think, yeah, so I focused a lot on policy with respect to my analysis here, but I think from that, I'm trying to get at the root of why are people supporting Donald Trump. And for me, you know, all these culture war issues notwithstanding, a lot of them are hurting and suffering socioeconomically. And a lot of them have not seen their conditions approved. And a lot of them have been dissatisfied with the Democratic Party, which has traditionally been the sympathetic party towards the working class. And they've been funneled into the Republican Party. So as troubling as Donald Trump is and his rhetoric is, I think that the Democrats, how do I say this? I think that even like the Democrats as a liberal party are also culpable in this rise of Trumpism because they have ignored and neglected and led on a lot of the electorate in promising we're going to be a different party, we're going to be a party of change, vote for us this time and this time we'll listen to you, or not do that at all and just running on same boring, ineffective trickle-down economic policies, which contribute to this cycle. I think you take Trump away, there's still this frustration on the base of Americans. And if that does not get addressed, there will be no return to this moderate idea or progressive idea or a non-fascist. It will not quell this fascist appetite in America. If we can even say that there is one, it does kind of seem to be what voters will do to have some sense of economic stability. I mean, Trump is promising horrifying mass deportations. That's very wishy-washy, potentially deporting even some American citizens, which that alone is horrific. Threats to democracy notwithstanding. But I think even then, like, there's an appetite for that in the electorate, motivated by just a lot of frustration. People think the Republican Party has told them that it's their neighbor who's an immigrant that's taking their job, and that's the reason why their life is horrible. Meanwhile, both parties, Democrats included, have been culpable and have encouraged a lot of policies like offshoring that are the real reason why, you know, someone in Ohio lost their job. It's not an immigrant, it's that. And if that's not addressed, then there will be no, you know, this horrifying Trump things will not go away.
Well, we seem to have turned our attention to the future of the two parties. Another very important aspect of this consideration is Robert Kennedy Jr. Is he going to have a future in the Republican Party in the event that Trump loses? Certainly he will if Trump wins, but if Trump loses, is he going to stay with the Republicans and perhaps challenge J.D. Vance as the next presidential Republican nominee? Or is he going to form his own party? Or I think the least likely scenario is he going to go back to the Democrats, but that would require a vastly revised Democratic Party to accept a person like that. Any thoughts in that regard?
I suspect he will leave politics if Trump loses. I think we will have heard the last of RFK, but maybe not. If Trump wins, I can imagine him having more influence than he ought.
Yeah, I don't really have a particular take, I guess, on RFK. He was, I think, only like a 5% at the polls at most. So even like, is that enough to, even if you wanted to run again, like what momentum are you building off of? So I think long term, like there's only so much conspiracy anti-vax stuff that you could, you know, pander until people kind of get sick of it. There'll always be a portion of the electorate that's just obsessed with that, but there'll never be enough to win an election, especially with how the US electoral college system functions.
Are there any more questions?
Yes. I agree with Greg Levine that the two parties are very different. And one thing that I heard recently was that 90% of the readers of the Washington Post and the New York Times are either Democrats or independents. So the members of the two parties or supporters of the two parties get their information from very different sources. And that's troubling. There's a huge amount of misinformation that it's a problem that needs to be addressed in both the United States and Canada. And I think the vitriol that is going on, which is unprecedented, is a huge problem. I think that democracy only works if if there's a huge amount of mutual respect, and that's disappearing. The other thing that worries me is that there's so many guns in the United States. So I think it's a tinderbox. And as Canadians, we ought to be very concerned about this and try to think of some solutions. I lost track of my relatives in the United States many decades ago, but I think both of you still have connections with the US. But is there anything that we can do to save that troubled country?
Well, we're approaching the end of our panel. Do we have any concluding questions?
Just don't have an answer to Ian's question. Probably not.
That's true.
One or
That's
two
true.
of us think of a solution.
Yeah, I mean, from a Canadian perspective, I doubt we have the resources of the CIA to orchestrate some type of regime change in the US to force a normalization. I mean, it's just difficult. Like, do we see another January 6th like event because of how upset voters are? Maybe it's possible. I wouldn't be surprised. I think it is gonna, like, back to the one of the first questions we got of, what happens with the result of the election. I think it's going to take some time with the Trump loss for voters to, digest and get their heads around. And there might be some fallout, hopefully not violent, but I'm sure there will be protests and things like that in the Capitol that the media will report accordingly. So yeah, I just think it's a difficult question. And as we're getting feedback here, I guess the microphone doesn't agree with me. But yeah, do you have anything to add? No. Okay.
Well, I think that what's required is a culture change. It's much of America is a very ugly culture. It's not a place I would ever want to live. And I'm afraid living next to it. It's making Canada increasingly untenable as a place to want to live as well. So I think we need to try to find some solutions.
Well, that may be a very good point at which to end our panel. I'd like to thank our speakers, Professor Robert Drummond and Nathaniel Denaro, for their excellent presentations. It's been a real pleasure trying to organize this panel. It's been very difficult, but also I'm glad I did it, and I'm glad we had an in-person event here at McLaughlin College. And thanks also to our online participants. And we will be having further panels and discussions co-sponsored by McLaughlin College and the York Collegium for Public Ethics. So thank you for your presentations and your participation, and we look forward to seeing all of you again soon. Bye-bye.